This is a production of Cornell University.
All right, good afternoon, I guess, everyone. My name is Swegarden. I am actually a PhD student in the section of horticulture. However, I am minoring in plant breeding and food science. And I wanted to come here today to kind of talk to you about a small little project that's, well, not really so small anymore. But it involves trying to connect consumers and plant breeders. And I thought that an imperative part of this project was that I actually communicate and talk to plant breeders as well, which is why I'm here today. To give you a little bit of background, I work in a diversified vegetable breeding program that's based out of Geneva. I work with Dr. Griffiths, who works with several different crops, including snap beans, dry beans, small fruited tomatoes, and many cole crops, including cabbage and broccoli, cauliflower. And then as of recently, we've kind of been focusing a lot on the leafy brassica types, which include kale and collard types. I'll just kind of give you an example of the diversity we're working with in the program. We've kind of taken some of the existing morphologies in the leafy brassica types, which include kind of like a collard or a Tuscan kale or a deep curly kind of kale, and really worked on developing and enhancing the aesthetics of these different leafy types, which includes the leaf shape, the leaf colors, and leaf sizes. And so as of right now, we've got an immense amount of diversity that, quite frankly, we don't really know what to do with. And so that's kind of where we sit. And as a result, we've kind of taken an integrated approach since I started almost 2 years ago now with the program. We've been working to make connections with New York City by performing chefs demonstrations, working with green markets and some of the farmers markets down in the city. We engage with lots of seed industry partners, trying to get feedback, having them come out to our field days and communicating with them. And then as of the summer, we'll begin some of our on-farm trialing with some of these new diversified leafy brassica hybrids. And so as such, I think we get a really good perspective of kind of who we might be interacting with across the food system in our breeding program. But when I first started in fall of 2015, I attended a lecture by New York Times journalist Amy Harmon. And during that lecture, she made a call for scientists to engage with the public in a more empathetic discussion. And I'm sure she was referring to the STEM community at large, but as a horticultural plant breeder, I kind of went through some self-reflection and really tried to think about how I was engaging with the public and how our program specifically was engaging with the public. And as such, I realized that there was really one group that we don't directly connect with all that often, and that is, in fact, the consumer. While inherently I think we understand as breeders that our products end up in the marketplace and are consumed in some capacity, we're not always directly interacting with them. And the reasons why I'm not entirely sure is that we view the volatility of consumer feedback and markets too crazy to really kind of wrap into something that we can integrate into our breeding program. Is that we don't really know what we think that we don't know what consumers want, or consumers don't really know what they want. Do we view this interaction with consumers as too time consuming? Do we not have the time for it? Are there language or translation barriers between plant breeders and consumers? Or is there just a lack of established methodology that can be used to connect these two players in the food system? And while, as I said, I don't really have the answer, I got thinking that, well, if it is in fact this last one that we don't have established methodology, where can we find them, and how can we begin to explore how to connect these two groups? And the answer kind of came to me during a product development class that I was taking in food science around the same time I attended this Amy Harmon seminar. And during this product development class, we talked about the typical food product development pipeline, where it's this really, this kind of semi-linear product development scheme where it starts off with exploratory ideas and concept developments, goes through a lot of qualitative and quantitative iterations, and then involves lots of different feedback from downstream players, including processors and consumers, and you just have this really iterative, complex kind of interaction that somehow leads to a prototype and eventually scaling up and release of a new food product. And I saw a lot of parallels between this food product development pipeline and a plant breeding pipeline as well, that we kind of go through that same exploratory exploratory trait concept identification. We do our population development, prototype development, and then eventually get into some of the early testing, advanced testing, and eventually, hopefully, a variety release as well. And so I thought that if we could see some parallels between the food product development pipeline and the plant breeding pipeline, maybe we can use some of those tactics and those methods that they use to, in the food product development pipeline as a means of connecting with consumers. And so I connected with the Sensory Evaluation Center in the Food Science Department to begin exploring established sensory analysis and consumer marketing techniques that are used commonly throughout the food industry. And once I began connecting with the Sensory Evaluation Center, we decided to actually perform a case study using an established plant breeding program, notably mine, that we are in, to see if there was any methodology that we could use on a more regular basis to connect with consumers. And one of the methods that we settled on to begin exploring was called Qualitative Multivariate Analysis. And this is a well-established product development tool that involves 8 different steps that is really just designed to expose the consumer and participants to the product that you're interested in a really intimate setting so that they become very familiar with the product and can describe it beyond just sensory modalities or kind of initial marketing perspective. So they get a really in-depth look at the product that you're trying to develop. And so through the use of this qualitative multivariate analysis, also known as QMA, what we're hoping to do is understand the importance of different plant traits through the consumer lens and kind of begin to create a trait hierarchy of sorts. And then understand what type of information we could draw from consumers that would not only be feasible to obtain for a plant breeder, but also applicable to a plant breeding program. And then evaluate QMA as a methodology in and of itself. Is this a methodology that plant breeders would want to use on a semi-regular basis in the first place? But most importantly, and probably the best part about this method, was that it kind of used broad strokes to talk to consumers, and as such, really provided a lot of opportunity to generate further hypotheses that we could use in our breeding program to connect with consumers as well. And so this was the platform that we used initially to begin exploring the relationship between plant breeders and consumers. So to get going, we decided to use the model crop of kale. If you haven't heard, it's a little trendy right now. And I guess I didn't pick it just because it's kale in and of itself. Picked it more because it has popularity and as such consumer familiarity, and just provides a platform for conversation. So it's not necessarily just about the kale, so we got to think a little bit beyond that. But we had also the diversity of a product set. So we could go into our breeding program and pick out 6 different lines to give to consumers that represented a diversity in the kale product category, I guess you could say. So the 6 different types we looked at were collard type, Tuscan kale, one of our yellowish kind of breeding lines, a Portuguese truncuta type with thick midribs, a classic deep curl kale, and then kind of a fizz Siberian kale as well. And then once we had that product set identified, we decided to bring on board 14 self-identified kale enthusiasts. That just means that they were familiar with kale, they prepared it themselves, and they liked it. And they were also creative and articulate. And that was really imperative in this discussion because these participants were bringing home these 6 different leaf types, trying them out, consuming them, and journaling about them. And we needed them to come back and be able to provide feedback. So we couldn't really tap into a consumer base that didn't like kale in the first place for this methodology. But once we had our product set and our participants identified, we sent them home with these 6 different leaf types, and over the course of 2 weeks, the consumers prepared these leaf types however they liked, and then they were required to just journal about their experiences and document their experiences through a photo journal as well. At the end of that 2 weeks, we brought all the consumers back in for a facilitated focus group. And this is a pretty intense 3-hour session in which we picked apart every emotion you could probably have regarding kale purchasing and consumption. But throughout that, as I said, we mentioned, we picked apart associated emotions. We developed a lexicon and did lexicon exercises to kind of identify what words and descriptors consumers were using to describe described kale, sensory modalities. And then we picked apart contextual associations, so were different leaf types associated with different culinary preparations. We also performed projective mapping exercises, which essentially just allowed the participants to identify axes of importance and then place those different varieties along those axes in order to identify relationships among those different leaf types. If that makes sense. And all the information that we took out of this facilitated focus group was used to build a value diagram, a trait hierarchy, and then an online Kano survey, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, walking out of this focus group, we ended up with a lot of qualitative information, which was kind of new territory for me. And a lot more value-oriented and value descriptors and emotions that I was expecting to. But some preliminary results that we got was that there was a preconceived iconic kale that was already defined in the consumer's mind, and that was kind of this leafy, curly kale type. And so that was kind of the current market class that we were confined to when we were discussing kale. So trying to push the consumer definition of a market class and the boundaries of what a consumer is calling kale might be difficult, and so that's something that we need to consider when we go about marketing or talking about some of our diversity in our breeding program. Consumers also emphasize the importance of what we call freshness indicators, so it had to have good storability, which differentiates kale from a lot of other leafy greens. Texture was extremely important, and the kale also needed to retain its shape shape and form throughout cooking and processing as well. I think perhaps one of the biggest things that we got out of this was that texture was one of the most important sensory perceptions and sensory modalities in the consumer's mind, and our breeding program had not focused on texture in the past. We, as I said, were inherently focused on aesthetics, which was the color and the shape of the leaves. And so moving forward, we need to be sure to identify and we need to focus on different texture traits as well. And then, as I said, we also got a lot of value information from the participants as well. There's a strong association with health, well-being, and community. And what you can do with all this information, and this is a bit of a busy slide, is begin to really identify a value diagram and kind of understand how what we do as plant breeders affects larger core values at the consumer level. So we might adjust a texture component, whether that be the fibrousness of a leaf, but if we do so, that must also translate throughout the consumer's interaction with this kale type. And so it is important to keep this in mind and important to inherently understand that we can very much, by making a minute and semi-small change to a leaf type, affect the ultimate identity and identification of this product with a consumer as well. So moving forward, I would say that QMA was really successful in doing what Amy Harmon called for, which was to create an empathetic discussion with consumers. I wouldn't say that it was necessarily the easiest methodology for a plant breeder to engage with, and I think that we need to explore other methodologies too, but it was a start at least. And then, so I'm going to continue to work with the Sensory Evaluation Center. As I said, QMA was a hypothesis-generating platform, and we have a lot more to work with. So we're going to validate a lot of what we saw in the focus group with an online survey, validate it in-house over in the Food Sensory Evaluation Center, develop lab protocols to measure texture quantitatively. We're also in the process of forming a descriptive panel that we can go to with our breeding lines to really evaluate some of these sensory modalities on a consistent basis. And then we're also in the process of developing a consumer kale sensory descriptor wheel, which will be really interesting to run through our breeding program as well. All of this in the hopes of continuing to support an integrative plant breeding program and really getting one step closer to connecting plant breeders and consumers in the future. With that, I just want to thank Alina and my advisor, Phil Griffiths, for all their support throughout this, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have or talk to you after if you like.
So we have time for 2 questions.
Dan?
Do you have a quantitative way to measure texture?
Yeah, so that's what we're working on. So I've got a summer scholar that will be coming, and that is hopefully what she will be working on in conjunction with the descriptive panel. So you can set up a descriptive panel who will be really trained in identifying different textural properties. So you can rate a leafy type from the texture of a peanut brittle to peanut butter, basically. But we want to validate that in the lab using a pentrometer or something else. And so that's what we're going to try to work on and see what the best protocols are.
Any more questions?
Yeah. Well, so it wouldn't work. We couldn't have done this if we had a panel that didn't like kale. We wouldn't have gotten any information out of them, basically. So it was fundamental that we had to have a group of panelists that liked and consumed kale in the first place. However, that's the ultimate goal, is to address the population that doesn't like your product, right? And so in the future, when we introduce new products, we will already have the sensory modalities identified and described for those different leaf types. So once we give it to them, we can identify what has changed about those leaf types and if that affects the perception from the people who don't like it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question? It's a really good one. I've got a consumer in my garden that likes to take a broccoli and cauliflower. They're meadow, and they will eat them. They're like vegetarian mice, essentially. And they'll take a seedlings of broccoli and cauliflower and they'll leave the kale, which does something. So is there So is there something about the leaf texture or a secondary metabolite in kale that's different from brassicas, from other brassicas?
So as far as I know, the secondary metabolites are relatively similar. I mean, it's the same species as cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower. I don't know the answer. What was the animal you said?
It's a meadow vole.
A meadow vole. Cool.
It's too crunchy.
It's too crunchy. I should include them. I'll start a meadow vole descriptive panel.
I'll put them in my garden this year.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. That would be great.
Join me in thanking the presentation.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.